Now that our project has a generate URL method and that we have added the references needed for us to make requests to the internet and deserialize JSON into C# objects, it's time for us to make those requests to the Foursquare API service. So what I'm going to do is create yet another folder inside of the Potable class library project. And this new folder, I'm going to call it logic. And it's in here where we're going to add all of the logic, all of the main logic of the application. I'm going to right click on logic, I'm going to add a new class, and this is going to be venue logic. So basically all of the logic that is going to have to do with venues is going to be inside of this class, which by the way, I will make public, while the venue class itself is just going to be the model of the venue, which means that it's going to have the properties for that venue. And we're going to take a look at that later. Right now we have to focus on making that request. So inside of this class, I want to create a new method. This method can be static, and what we want it is to return a list of venues. And this is how I define a list. By the way, let me add a using directive for us to be able to use the venue class. And so this is how you define a list. You define a list with this type, and then among these angle brackets, you define the type of the list. So this is a generic list. We have briefly mentioned generics. This just means that all of the values inside of the list are going to be of this type. And so all of the methods that we have inside of the list are going to return this type as well. If you aren't able to use the list class, you have to add a using directive to system.collections.generic. And then this method is going to call getVenues, and it's going to request the latitude and the longitude both as doubles. And it's in here where we want to create a functionality. Now first I am going to be defining a new list of venue, which I'm going to call venues, and is going to be equal to a brand new list. And then right to the bottom, I'm going to return these venues. Now, of course, it's what happens in the middle what matters. Right now, I'm just defining the object and making sure it is being returned. But it's in the middle where we want to get all of those venues and assign them to the venues variable. The first thing that we're going to need is the URL. And the URL can be created through the venue class, which has a generate URL method, which by the way also requests the latitude and the longitude. And once we have the URL, we have to make the request. And we're going to be able to make the request through the HTTP client class. To be able to use this class, we have to add a using directive to system.net.http, which is a namespace that exists inside of one of the references that we added in the previous lecture. Here we're going to have to create a new client, which is going to be equal to a new HTTP client. Now for this, we're also going to have to use a using statement, similarly to what we did when we were creating connections to the SQLite database. So we make sure that the client is disposed by the end of this execution. Now the client is the one that will allow us to make requests. So client has a getAsync method, which is the one that will allow us to get from the Foursquare service. And this method is going to require the URL. So we can pass the URL. And we can await for this, because this is an async method. And because we are waiting, we're going to have to make this method an async method as well. And now, because we have created this as an async method, and this is not a void method, and we want to return something, we have to make this a task. A task that will return a list of venues. So by default, this getVenues method is going to be a task. But once it's awaited, once it's completed, we will have access to this type, which is a list of venue. Now, also, once the getAsync method is completed, we're going to get the response from the service. So we want to make sure that we have it inside of this variable. And it is inside of this response where the JSON is going to be located. So let's get that JSON as well. The JSON is going to be inside of the response.content, but the content is not a string. So let's get it as a string by using the read as string async. Now again, this is an async method, so we will have to await it to actually get that string. And there we go. This is everything that we have to do to get that JSON, similar to what we saw when we were exploring the API. But right now, we're not really calling this method. This method has to be called from somewhere. And that somewhere is going to be the new travel page. Because it's in here where we're not only going to be requiring the user to write their experience, but to select a venue. Select the venue where they had that experience. So I am going to navigate to that new travel page, in this case the C# file, and what I want to do is override the onAppearing method. So every time we navigate to this page, we get the user's location again, and we request the venues for that location. So that's exactly the first thing that we have to do. We will need a locator, which remember that has to be equal to cross geolocator. To be able to use this, we have to add a using directive to plugin.geolocator, and we have to get the current. And then we can get the position by calling from the locator the get position async. Now this is an async method, so we have to await it, and we will have to make this an async method. And so we should now have the latitude and longitude. So we can now create a new variable, which is going to be venues, that is going to be equal to venue logic, which is the class that we have just created. We still need to add a using directive to its namespace, and this class has the get venues method. It's static, so we do not need an instance, and we're going to pass whatever is in position.latitude and position.longitude, which notice are doubles, and we are requesting doubles, so we do not need to do any casting. And there you have it. I'm going to add a breakpoint right after we get this venue, so we see if the venues actually has something inside. And basically what is going on is that we are going to be navigating to the new travel page, and every time that happens, we're going to get the user's location, and we're going to get the venues. We're going to get the venues by calling the get venues method that we just defined, which through the HTTP client class is going to be making a request. In this case, it's going to be making a get request to the URL that we generated, and from the response that it gets, it's going to obtain the content as a string, which is going to have JSON. Now, right now, we're not really deserializing this JSON into venues, so I am going to add a breakpoint in here, and actually the breakpoint over here we don't really need right now. What I'm going to do is evaluate if this JSON actually has something. And lastly, we create the URL with the generate URL method that is going to format a string with the latitude and longitude that we are going to be receiving for the location of the user, the client ID and client secret that we have because we created an application from the Foursquare for Developers page, and it's going to create a string from today's date with a certain format. So let's go ahead and test this, and I already have my breakpoint set to see if I'm actually receiving a response. And I'm going to test this on the Android simulator. You can test it on either simulator. Both are going to be making the same request with the same URL, and so we will see what we are getting. So I have the app up and running. I'm going to click on login. I am going to select add so I get navigated to the new travel page. And first I should probably establish some latitude and longitude. So I'm going to send this so the emulator gets it and can make the call to the get venues. And notice that we now hit the breakpoint. So first, from the new travel page, we were getting the location. And because this is async, it took its time to get the location until we established it on the simulator. And then it called the get venues method. It made the request to the internet. It also took its time because this is an async method and this is a request to the internet. So it took its time. And so let's see if we have a JSON. All you have to do is hover over this variable. And if the latitude and longitude that you set is close to civilization, it's very likely that you will see a JSON. And not only a JSON, but one that has a response with a list of venues. And notice that indeed we can see something that can be a little bit similar to what we saw when we were exploring the Foursquare API. We see a meta somewhere in here, we see a response and some venues, And we can see the name of a venue in here, and we can see that it even has some Google and Facebook information. I see a latitude and a longitude in here, but mainly this is an entire mess. And this is very big in this case. We probably have many venues inside of this JSON. So how do we make sense of this? Are we going to have to evaluate all of this to be able to create an object? Well, in the next lecture, we're going to learn exactly what to do. But mainly, what we have to do is analyze this JSON for us to define the C# types. Because even if we do have the Newtonsoft.json reference, we need to tell those classes what is this JSON going to look like once it is converted into C# objects. And don't worry, I'm going to introduce you to a very cool tool that will make this very easy. For now, we have successfully requested information to an endpoint in the internet, in this case the Foursquare API search endpoint. In the next lecture, we're going to take this response and evaluate what this is going to look like when converted into a C# object.